Welcome, dear wanderer of the night hours, to this long and winding journey through the corridors of divine memory, where we shall trace the footsteps of gods who once stood at the pinnacle of creation, only to tumble into the depths of their own undoing. Tonight, we embark on a 3-hour odyssey through realms both luminous and shadowed, following the paths of deities who learned that even immortal power can slip through divine fingers like grains of cosmic sand. I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight, as you settle into your chosen space of rest, preparing to drift alongside these ancient tales that have been whispered through millennia. Whether you find yourself beneath northern stars or southern constellations, in bustling cities or quiet countryside, know that you are joining a timeless tradition of nighttime storytelling that stretches back to the very dawn of human consciousness. Here on Boring Mythology, we honor that tradition by weaving these tales into gentle tapestries designed to carry you through the entire arc of your sleep. As the world outside your window settles into its own nocturnal rhythm, let us begin our descent into the realm of fallen divinity, where power once absolute became chains of eternal consequence, where thrones of heaven and earth crumbled beneath the weight of pride, betrayal, and cosmic justice. Tonight, we shall walk with 7 mighty beings whose stories echo through every pantheon, every mythology, every whispered prayer and forgotten temple. First, we shall witness the magnificent horror of Kronos, the titan who devoured time itself, who swallowed his own children in desperate attempts to halt the wheel of fate, only to find himself imprisoned in the very depths he once ruled. His story begins not with his fall, but with the golden age he commanded, when time moved differently, when mortals lived for centuries, when the earth gave forth its bounty without the touch of plow or seed. Picture, if you will, the world as it was under his reign. The air itself was thick with honeyed sweetness. Rivers ran with milk and nectar, and death was but a gentle sleep that came only after countless seasons of contentment. The trees bore fruit that never rotted. The flowers bloomed eternal, and pain was a concept yet unborn. In this realm, Kronos sat upon a throne carved from a single block of temporal crystal, a substance that existed in all moments simultaneously, reflecting past, present, and future in its infinite facets. Then, through the mists of northern realms, we shall find Loki bound beneath the earth, the trickster whose silver tongue wove stories that became reality, whose shape-shifting nature made him neither god nor giant, neither friend nor foe, but something far more complex and terrible. Even now, in the depths of his binding, drops of venom fall upon his face from the serpent placed above him by hands that once called him brother. His wife, Sigyn, holds her bowl to catch the poison. But when she must empty it, his screams shake the foundations of Midgard, and mortals feel the earth tremble. Yet this is not where his story ends, nor where it begins, but merely one eternal moment in an existence that defies the simple arc of rise and fall. From the northern cold, we journey to the burning sands of Egypt, where Set, god of chaos and storms, once stood as protector of Ra's solar bark, defending the sun itself from the serpent of oblivion. How strange that he who fought chaos became its embodiment, that he who protected became destroyer, that he who was beloved of Ra became the enemy of all order. In the red desert that bears his name, sandstorms still carry whispers of his rage, and in the twilight hours when the sun bleeds crimson across the dunes, one can almost see his form, massive and indefinable, struggling against the chains of his own nature. Our path then ascends, paradoxically, into the depths of the fall itself, where Lucifer, the morning star, the light bringer, the most beautiful of all created beings, tumbled through dimensions beyond counting, his descent lasting eons and instants simultaneously. Before his fall, heaven itself was different, brighter somehow with his presence, for he was the first light after the word, the initial thought made radiant, the prototype of beauty itself. Angels would gather to hear him sing, and his voice would create new constellations, birth nebulae, and set comets on their eternal journeys. Even now, in whatever realm he inhabits, that voice remains unchanged, though it speaks different words, sings different songs, dreams different dreams. Near him in suffering, though separated by cosmologies, we find Prometheus, whose gift to humanity was not merely fire, but consciousness itself, the spark that separated human from animal, that made mortals capable of looking up at the stars and wondering. Chained to his mountain, his liver devoured daily by an eagle that is itself divine, he experiences not just physical agony, but the metaphysical weight of knowing that his torment serves as warning to any who would elevate the lowly, who would share the privileges of heaven with the dust of earth. Yet, in his eyes, should any dare to look, burns still the same fire he stole, undiminished, unrepentant, unextinguished. Before all of these, before time had learned to count itself, before darkness knew it was dark, there was Tiamat, the primordial mother, the saltwater chaos from whose body the world itself was carved. She who gave birth to the first gods, who sang the songs that separated sky from sea, who existed when existence was still deciding what it meant to exist. Her defeat, her dismemberment, her transformation into the physical universe itself represents the first fall, the prototype of all divine tragedies to come. In every ocean wave, in every tear, in every drop of morning dew, something of her remains, remembering wholeness, dreaming of the time before time when she was complete. And finally, we shall witness the primal overthrow, the first son destroying the first father, as Kronos himself once rose against Uranus, the sky father who pressed so heavily upon Gaia, the earth mother, that their children could not emerge into being. With a sickle forged from the earth's own bones, Kronos castrated his father, separating sky from earth forever, allowing space for existence to breathe and grow between them. The blood that fell from that wound became the Furies, the giants, and some say the seeds of every revolution to come, divine or mortal. These 7 stories are not separate tales, but movements in a single symphony of power and loss, of reaching too high or holding too tight, of the inevitable cycle that turns every victory into eventual defeat, every throne into eventual prison. As we journey through each story tonight, you will find that they reflect and refract through each other, like light through a prism of divine tears, each one containing elements of all the others, each fall echoing every other fall, backwards and forwards through time. The air around you now grows heavier with story, thick with the accumulated weight of millennia of telling and retelling. Your breathing naturally begins to slow, matching the rhythm of ages, the pulse of mythological time that moves not in seconds, but in epochs. Your eyelids, should they still be open, carry the weight of all these fallen crowns, these broken wings, these silenced songs. And as we prepare to enter more deeply into our first tale, know that you are safe here in the present, merely a listener, a dreamer, a temporary visitor to these realms of consequence and memory. In the time before Zeus knew his own name, before lightning had learned to strike, before eagles had discovered the sky, there ruled a being whose very presence caused time to pool and eddy like water disturbed by a fallen stone. The world under Kronos was not measured in heartbeats or breaths, not in days or seasons as we know them, but in something far more fluid, far more generous with its permissions and possibilities. First, the golden light would seep across the land each morning, not the harsh brightness of our current sun, but something mellower, like honey dissolved in warm wine, spreading across the sky with no urgency, no schedule to keep. The mortals of that age, if mortals they could truly be called, would wake not from necessity, but from desire, their bodies requiring neither food nor shelter in the traditional sense, sustained instead by the ambient perfection that Kronos had woven into the very air they breathed. Then the fruits would ripen on branches that never knew winter, perpetually heavy with sustenance that tasted of whatever the eater most desired, transforming on the tongue into memories of satisfaction, into the essence of contentment itself. The rivers in Kronos' age did not merely flow. They meandered in patterns that pleased the eye and soothed the spirit. Their waters naturally warm where warmth was wanted, cool where coolness would refresh. Fish within them swam in schools that created living mandalas, their scales catching and refracting light in patterns that told stories without words, prophecies without doom. No one aged beyond their perfect moment, that instant when beauty and wisdom achieved their ideal balance. Children grew to this point and stopped. Parents remained there, and grandparents, if such relationships even existed in that timeless time, appeared no different from their descendants. Kronos himself moved through this realm not as ruler, but as architect of contentment. His presence felt rather than seen, like the weight of perfect temperature, the comfort of ideal humidity, the satisfaction of exactly enough light. His throne, when he chose to manifest it, stood at the center of all things, yet touched no specific place, existing in that paradoxical state that only divine furniture can achieve, being simultaneously everywhere and nowhere, always and never. But within this perfection lurked the seed of its own unmaking, for Kronos carried within him the knowledge of prophecy, that cursed gift of seeing what must come to pass. His own father, Uranus, had spoken it with his last coherent breath, had carved it into reality with the authority that dying gods possess, that Kronos too would fall to his own child, just as Uranus had fallen to him. The cycle would continue, must continue, for this was the nature of power itself, to rise and fall like breath, like tides, like the beating of some cosmic heart that required both systole and diastole to continue its eternal rhythm. Picture Kronos in his throne room, if room it could be called, more accurately described as a fold in space where authority concentrated itself, where decisions became reality simply by being considered. The walls, such as they were composed of crystallized time, each facet showing a different moment from past and future, creating a kaleidoscope of possibility and memory that would drive a mortal mind to immediate and irreversible madness. Here, Kronos contemplated his predicament. This god who controlled time itself, yet could not escape the temporal trap of prophecy. His solution, when it came, was both elegant and horrible, logical and insane. If his children would overthrow him, then his children must never truly exist. Not killed, For divine children cannot truly die, but consumed, absorbed, made part of himself so completely that they could never become separate enough to fulfill their prophesied role. And so, as his wife Rhea brought forth their offspring, each one perfect, each one containing within them the seeds of new ages, new possibilities, new ways for existence to express itself, Kronos would take them, these infant deities, and swallow them whole. First came Hestia, goddess of the hearth, she who would have brought warmth and center to all homes. As Kronos consumed her, every fire in the mortal realm flickered, dimmed for just a moment, as if the very concept of comfort had been questioned. She descended into her father's belly, not screaming, but silent, already accepting, already understanding that this too was part of some larger pattern she would one day help to weave. Within Kronos, she existed in a state that was neither life nor death, neither consciousness nor oblivion, but something else, something that no mortal language has words to describe. Then came Demeter, she of the grain, she of the harvest, carrying within her infant form the potential bounty of cultivated earth. As she disappeared into her father's maw, the wild plants of the world shuddered, sensing somehow that their domestication, their partnership with humanity, had been delayed, deferred, swallowed along with this golden-haired infant, whose cries sounded like wind through wheat fields that did not yet exist. Inside Kronos, she joined her sister in that strange non-place, that divine stomach that was larger than worlds, smaller than thought. Hera followed, regal even in infancy, her tiny fists clenched, not in fear, but in fury, already possessing the righteous anger that would one day make her queen of heaven. As Kronos swallowed her, marriages across the mortal realm felt a moment of uncertainty, as if the very bonds between beings had been momentarily questioned, examined, found temporarily wanting. She descended, fighting, struggling against the inevitable with a determination that would echo through all her future actions, all her future jealousies and judgments. Hades came next, silent and grave, even as a newborn, his dark eyes holding depths that seemed to go down forever, past the foundations of the earth, into realms that even Kronos preferred not to contemplate. As he was consumed, shadows across the world grew slightly longer, slightly darker, as if reaching for something they had lost, something they might never regain. He made no sound as he joined his siblings, accepting his fate with the stoic dignity that would later make him the most just, if least loved, of all the ruling gods. Then Poseidon, born with the sound of waves, his infant laughter like tide against shore, his tears like the salt of primordial oceans. As Kronos swallowed him, every body of water in existence rippled without wind, waves without cause, as if the sea itself was protesting, was grieving, was raging against this consumption of its future lord. He struggled more than the others, his infant strength already remarkable, his will to exist, to be separate, to rule his own domain, powerful even then. With each child consumed, Kronos grew heavier, not in body, but in spirit, in that indefinable weight that comes from carrying within oneself contradictions that cannot be resolved. He was simultaneously father and tomb, protector and destroyer, the guardian of his own power and the architect of his own eventual downfall. For prophecies, as even gods must learn, are not instructions but descriptions, not warnings but promises, and in trying to prevent them, one often becomes the very mechanism of their fulfillment. Rhea, mother of these consumed gods, watched each consumption with growing horror and determination. She was sister wife to Kronos, understanding him as only one who shared his origin could. Yet she was also mother. And that role, that fundamental expression of creative force, could not accept this perversion of birth, this transformation of emergence into submergence. With each child lost to Kronos' belly, she planned, she prepared, she evolved from accepting spouse to clever deceiver, from passive participant to active rebel. When Zeus quickened within her womb, she felt difference in this child, a spark of something that even Kronos, for all his paranoia, had not anticipated. This child carried within him not just the potential for rule, but the certainty of it, a fate so strongly woven into his being that it affected everything around him even before his birth. Rhea knew that this one must survive, must grow, must fulfill the prophecy that Kronos so feared. And so she prepared her deception, her one chance to break the cycle of consumption. The night of Zeus's birth, the very stars held their breath, their light dimming as if to avoid drawing attention to what was about to occur. Rhea gave birth in secret, in a cave on Mount Ida in Crete, a place so remote that even divine eyes struggled to perceive it, wrapped as it was in mists that existed before distinction between earth and sky. The infant Zeus emerged not crying, but laughing, a sound like thunder playing in distant clouds, like the promise of storms that would reshape the world. Instead of this divine child, Rhea brought to Kronos a stone, wrapped in swaddling clothes, still warm from her body, disguised with all the cunning that desperation can produce. The stone was no ordinary rock, but one pulled from the foundation of the earth itself, carrying weight and significance beyond its simple mineral composition. As Kronos took what he believed to be his son, Rhea's heart broke and soared simultaneously, shattered by the necessity of deception, elevated by the hope of revolution. Kronos swallowed the stone without examination, without suspicion, for paranoia, paradoxically, can make one blind to actual threats while seeing imaginary ones everywhere. The stone descended into that strange divine stomach where his other children existed in their non-death, their unlife, and something shifted in the cosmic order. The stone, being truly lifeless, truly unconscious, created a kind of anchor point, a reality around which the consumed gods could begin to orient themselves, to remember that they were separate beings, not merely dreams in their father's belly. Meanwhile, Zeus grew in secret, raised by various beings depending on which story you follow, which truth you prefer among the many truths that mythology offers. Some say the goat Amalthea nursed him with milk that conferred invulnerability. Others claim the Curetes, those dancing warriors, disguised his infant cries with the clash of spear on shield. Still others insist that the very earth herself, Gaia, grandmother to this hidden god, nurtured him with honey that dripped from sacred trees and water that bubbled from springs that would later be forgotten by mortal geography. As Zeus grew, so did his power, but more importantly, so did his understanding of what must be done. He was not merely growing toward a confrontation, but toward a transformation of the very nature of divine rule. Where Kronos had swallowed to preserve, Zeus would vomit forth to liberate. Where Kronos had held time in rigid perfection, Zeus would allow it to flow, to change, to evolve, even if that evolution meant suffering, meant death, meant the end of the golden age and the beginning of ages of silver, bronze, and iron. The approach of Zeus's maturity sent ripples through reality. That Kronos, in his security, in his confidence that all threats were safely contained within his own belly, failed to perceive. Birds began to fly in patterns that spelled out rebellions in languages not yet invented. Wolves howled harmonies that spoke of change, of hunt, of the young devouring the old. Even the wind carried whispers of what was coming, though in sounds so subtle that only those already suspicious might hear them. When Zeus finally came to his father, he came not as warrior, but as cup-bearer, disguised by divine craft and aided by Metis, goddess of cunning, who would later become his first wife and, in echoes of his father's actions, be swallowed by Zeus himself, though for different reasons, with different results. The drink Zeus offered was not wine, but something far more potent, a mixture of substances that exist only in the realm of divine chemistry, things that could cause a god to lose control of his own internal existence, his own digestive absolute. Kronos drank deeply, trustingly, for the disguise was perfect, the deception complete. The liquid burned down his throat like liquid time, like concentrated change, like revolution, distilled into drinkable form. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, Kronos felt something he had never felt before. His stomach rebelling, his control slipping, his internal world becoming external against his will. First came the stone, expelled with such force that it flew across the cosmos, eventually landing at Delphi, where it would become the omphalos, the navel of the world, the center point around which prophecy would concentrate. Then, in reverse order of their consumption, came his children, fully grown, fully aware, fully furious. Poseidon emerged like a tidal wave given form, Hades like shadow becoming solid, Hera like judgment incarnate, Demeter like harvest, ready for reaping, and finally, Hestia, first swallowed and last released, completing the circle, the cycle, the terrible symmetry of it all. The transition from Kronos' golden realm to the harsh winters of the Norse cosmos requires us to travel not just through space, but through the very fabric of mythological reality, where warm Mediterranean certainties give way to the cold uncertainties of the north, where destiny is not a thread, but a web, where gods know they will die and feast anyway, laugh anyway, love anyway. In defiance of the twilight, they know must come. Feel the temperature drop as we leave behind the eternal spring of Kronos' age, and enter a world where winter is not just a season, but a character in the story, where ice is not merely frozen water, but the substance from which entire realms are carved. The very air grows thinner, sharper, carrying within it the scent of pine resin and iron, of snow that has never melted and never will, of the breath of wolves that are larger than mountains and older than memory. In this place, before we speak his name, before we give him the power that naming brings, let us observe him through his effects, through the changes he wreaks simply by existing. Watch as a salmon swimming upstream suddenly becomes a horse galloping across meadows. See how a fly buzzing in the mead hall transforms into an old woman cackling at the gods' feast. Notice how stories told straight suddenly twist, how plans carefully laid suddenly unravel, how the serious becomes absurd, and the absurd becomes deadly serious. This is how Loki moves through the world, not as himself, but as everything else, as anyone else, as the force that ensures no boundary remains uncrossed, no form remains fixed, no truth remains absolute. He is the question mark at the end of every certainty, the but that follows every declaration, the laugh that erupts at the most solemn moment. the tear that falls during the greatest joy. To understand Loki is to understand that understanding itself is a joke he's playing on those who think they understand. First, the giants knew him, for he was born of their blood. Though which giant, and under what circumstances changes with each telling, as if his very origin refuses to remain stable. Some say his father was Farboti, whose name means cruel striker, and his mother was Laufi, whose name means leafy island, making him the offspring of lightning and trees, of destruction and growth, of the violent moment when fire and wood meet. Others insist he simply appeared, manifested from the cosmic need for disruption, for the agent that prevents any system from becoming too stable, too predictable, too safe. Then the Aesir gods knew him, not as enemy, but as blood brother to Odin himself, the All-Father who hung himself on the world tree for 9 days to gain wisdom, who sacrificed his eye for knowledge, who understood perhaps better than any that wisdom and folly, order and chaos, creation and destruction are not opposites, but dance partners in the cosmic ballet. When Odin and Loki mixed their blood, they created a bond that could never be fully severed, no matter how much either might later wish it could be. In the great hall of Asgard, Loki sat at the gods' table, drank their mead, shared their jokes, solved their problems with solutions that created new problems, saved them from disasters that his own actions had often caused. He was simultaneously the most valuable and most dangerous of companions, the one you wanted on your side precisely because you never wanted him as your enemy, though having him as your friend was hardly less perilous. Consider the rules of his nature, if rules they can be called when applied to one whose essence is the breaking of rules. Loki could not help but transform not just his shape, but the shape of situations around him. Order offended him not morally, but aesthetically. The way a musician might be offended by a note held too long, a rhythm too predictable. He would look at the gods' perfect faces and see not beauty, but boredom. See not divinity, but an invitation for alteration, for the introduction of flaws that make perfection actually perfect by making it imperfect. His transformations were not mere illusions, but actual becoming. When Loki became a mare, he truly was female, truly was horse, so completely that he could conceive and bear offspring. When he became a salmon, he possessed every instinct of the fish, every scale, every capability of swimming against currents, both literal and metaphorical. When he became an old woman, he knew the weight of years he had never lived, the wisdom of experiences he had never had, the cunning that comes from being underestimated for centuries. The gods tolerated him, needed him, feared him, loved him in the complicated way one loves a beautiful weapon that might turn in your hand. He gave them gifts that cost them dearly. Thor's hammer, obtained through Loki's wager, but requiring the gods to nearly lose him to the dwarves. Odin's spear and ring. Sif's golden hair, all treasures that existed only because Loki's mischief had first created the need for them. He was the poison that was also the cure, the problem that was also the solution, the curse that was also the blessing. In the sensory realm of Asgard, Loki's presence could be felt as a subtle wrongness that was also rightness, like a painting where the perspective is slightly off in a way that makes you look closer, think deeper, see more than you would if everything were properly aligned. The temperature around him was never quite what it should be. Always a degree warmer or cooler than comfort. Always requiring adjustment, adaptation, awareness. Even his scent changed, sometimes like ozone before lightning. Sometimes like flowers that shouldn't bloom in snow. Sometimes like nothing at all. Which was perhaps the most unsettling scent of all. His children, born of various liaisons that defied not just propriety but physics, were prophecies made flesh. Warnings that the gods chose to see as threats rather than teachers. With the giantess Angrboda, whose name means she who brings grief, Loki fathered 3 offspring that would shape the end of everything. First came Fenrir, the wolf whose growth could not be stopped, whose hunger could not be satisfied, whose destiny was to swallow the All-Father himself. Then Jörmungandr, the world serpent, who grew so vast he could encircle Midgard and grasp his own tail, whose release of that tail would signal the beginning of the end. Finally, Hel, half living, half dead, ruler of the realm that bore her name, where most of the dead would go, not as punishment, but as simple consequence of not dying gloriously in battle. The gods looked upon these children and saw their own doom written in flesh and scale and fur, rather than question why such beings had come to exist, what cosmic need they fulfilled, what balance they restored. The Aesir chose fear over understanding, chose preemptive action over patient observation. They cast Jörmungandr into the ocean, where he grew in the dark waters, fed by the fears of sailors and the offerings of those who understood that some gods are best appeased by distance. They gave Hel dominion over the dead, granting her a kingdom they thought would keep her contained, not understanding that death cannot be contained, only delayed, deferred, or embraced. And Fenrir they tried to chain. The binding of Fenrir became Loki's first true break with the gods, though he helped them do it, though he persuaded his son to accept the chains, though he stood by as the wolf was betrayed. Watch as even now, in memory, in myth, In the eternal retelling, Loki places his hand in his son's mouth as surety, as promise that this is just a game, just another test of strength. Feel the moment when Fenrir realizes the deception, when his jaws close and Loki loses his hand. No, wait, that was Tyr who lost his hand. Loki lost something far more precious. He lost the last of his ability to pretend that the gods were his family, that Asgard was his home, that there was a place for chaos at Order's table. The final break, the ultimate transgression, came at a feast. Because where else would Norse crisis come but where mead flows and boasts are made? Balder, the beautiful, the beloved, the shining one whose mere presence made everything better, brighter, more bearable, was dead. Killed by a dart of mistletoe thrown by his blind brother Hödr, guided by Loki's hand, Loki's voice, Loki's irresistible need to find the flaw in every protection, the exception to every rule. The gods had made Balder invulnerable to everything that had sworn not to harm him. Everything except the mistletoe. Too young, too small, too insignificant to bother asking for its oath. In that moment of the dart's flight, in that space between release and impact, between joke and tragedy, between laughter and silence, Loki became something else. Not trickster, but destroyer. Not chaos, but catastrophe. Not the god who transgressed boundaries, but the god who obliterated them entirely. The sound of Balder falling was like light itself hitting the ground, like hope becoming meat, like the future collapsing into a present that nobody wanted, but everybody now had to live with. The gods mourned as only immortals can mourn, with the kind of grief that comes from losing something you thought could never be lost. They sent messages to Hel, Loki's own daughter, begging for Balder's return. She set a condition that revealed the impossible cruelty of hope. If everything in existence would weep for Balder, she would release him. And everything did weep. Stones wept moisture, iron wept rust, mountains wept avalanches. Everything except one old giantess in a cave who refused to shed a single tear. That giantess was Loki, of course, holding the line of his crime, refusing to let even universal grief undo what his nature had compelled him to do. The bonds they prepared for Loki were not made of iron or bronze, not forged in any smith's fire or cooled in any earthly water. The dwarves, those craftsmen of impossible things, wove them from the sound of a cat's footfall, the beard of a woman, the roots of a mountain, the sinews of a bear, the breath of a fish, and the spittle of a bird, things that do not exist, and therefore could not be broken by any force that did exist. They called this binding Gleipnir, and it looked like nothing more than a silken ribbon beautiful and harmless, which was perhaps the cruelest joke of all, that Loki's binding should itself be a trick, a deception, a thing that was not what it seemed. But first, they had to catch him. And how do you catch the wind's brother, the fire's friend, the shape that has no shape? They hunted him through every form he took, as a salmon leaping up waterfalls, as an eagle soaring above the clouds, as a flea hiding in the goddess's hair. In each form, he was perfect, complete, more truly that thing than the thing itself. As a salmon, he invented the very concept of swimming upstream. As an eagle, he discovered thermals that had never existed before. As a flea, he found new ways to irritate divinity that would be remembered in every itch forever after. Finally, exhausted from being everything except himself, Loki was caught in a net of his own design. For he had invented the fishing net while trying to think of ways to escape, drawing it in the ashes of his fire, not realizing that in creating the concept of capture, he had created the means of his own catching. The gods found him in a river, transformed into a salmon, and though he leaped higher than any fish had ever leaped, though he twisted in ways that defied the very structure of fish spines, Thor's hand closed around him, and that grip would never release. They dragged him to a cave that exists in no earthly geography, a place where the stone itself remembers pain, where darkness has weight and substance, where time moves not forward but inward, spiraling into itself like a wound that refuses to heal. There they took 3 stones, each one carved from mountains that had witnessed the birth of the world, and transformed them into restraints that held not just Loki's body, but his very essence, his ability to change, to become other, to escape into transformation. His son Vali, transformed by the gods into a wolf, tore apart his other son, Narfi. And from Narfi's entrails, they made chains that hardened into something harder than iron, harder than reality, harder than the fate that even gods cannot escape. These chains bound Loki to the stones, spread-eagled, vulnerable, more fixed in place than he had ever been in his existence. The binding was not just physical, but metaphysical, holding him in one form, one location, one eternal moment of consequence. Above him, the gods placed a serpent, one of the children of his own offspring Jormungandr, completing the circular cruelty of it all. From the serpent's fangs dripped venom, each drop a distillation of all the poison Loki had ever spread through words, through actions, through his mere existence. The venom fell toward his face in a rhythm that was not quite regular, not quite predictable, ensuring that he could never fully prepare for the next drop, never fully recover from the last. Sigyn His wife, she who had chosen him despite everything, despite knowing what he was, came to the cave with a bowl. She holds it still, catching the venom before it reaches his face, her arms trembling with an exhaustion that regenerates just slowly enough that she can never rest. When the bowl fills, she must turn away to empty it, and in those moments, the venom falls directly onto Loki's face. His screams then are not just sound, but seismic events, earthquakes that remind the world above that below their feet writhes a god in agony, a force of chaos temporarily contained but never conquered. In this transition from Loki's binding to Set's fall, feel how the cave's darkness begins to warm, how the cold stone becomes hot sand, how the serpent's venom transforms into the burning wind of the desert. The mythology shifts, flows like the sand dunes themselves, reshaping into new patterns while maintaining the eternal theme of divine downfall, of power that consumes itself, of gods who become the very thing they once opposed. Set's story begins not in darkness, but in necessity. For he was born as the defender, the one who stood at the prow of Ra's solar bark each night, fighting off Apophis, the serpent of chaos who sought to devour the sun and return all existence to the primordial void. Every evening, as Ra descended into the underworld to bring light to the dead, Set was there with his spear, his strength, his ferocity that matched and exceeded the chaos serpent's own. He was violence in service of order, destruction, preventing greater destruction, the necessary evil that kept the unnecessary evil at bay. Picture. Set in those early days, his strange form that Egyptian artists could never quite capture consistently. Sometimes with the head of an unknown animal, sometimes purely human, but wrong somehow. Sometimes a combination of features that belonged to no single creature, but to all creatures, to the very concept of otherness itself. His fur, if fur it was the color of the red desert, that shade that is neither fully red nor fully orange, but something that exists only where life struggles against lifelessness and occasionally wins. His eyes held the heat of noon in the wasteland, the moment when mirages become indistinguishable from reality, when the brain begins to cook in its own skull, when visions and truth become one. He was the god of foreigners, of the desert beyond the fertile Nile Valley, of all the spaces and peoples that Egypt defined itself against. Yet he was also fundamentally Egyptian, brother to Osiris, Isis, and Nephthys, born from Nut and Geb, sky and earth, as essential to the cosmic order as any of his more beloved siblings. This paradox being simultaneously insider and outsider, protector and threat, would define both his rise and his fall. The relationship between Set and his brother Osiris was complex from the beginning, a rivalry that was also a partnership, a hatred that was also love, a conflict that was also cooperation. Osiris ruled the black earth, the fertile soil that the Nile's flooding renewed each year, bringing life, abundance, civilization itself. Set ruled the red earth, the desert that preserved the dead through desiccation, that challenged humans to become more than they were through adversity, that protected Egypt by being the barrier no invading army could easily cross. Together, they were the balance, life and death, growth and limitation, the known and the unknown. But balance, as every mythology teaches us, is not a stable state, but a constant struggle, a tension that must eventually resolve, usually in catastrophe. For Set, watching his brother receive the prayers of millions while he received the fearful appeasals of hundreds, seeing Osiris crowned as king while he remained the eternal prince of wastelands, something began to shift in his divine essence, like a sand dune moving grain by grain, until suddenly the entire landscape has changed. What matters is not the method, but the meaning. Set had crossed from necessary opposition into unnecessary destruction, from the chaos that defines order into the chaos that destroys it. In killing Osiris, he killed a part of himself, the part that understood his role in the greater pattern, that accepted his place as the unloved but necessary god. He became, then, not the desert that challenges, but the desert that consumes. Not the storm that clears the air, but the storm that obliterates. Not the foreign that defines the familiar, but the foreign that conquers it. The transformation in Set was visible to those who knew how to look. His red coloring deepened to the shade of dried blood. His strange animal head became stranger still, features shifting moment to moment as if he could no longer remember what he was supposed to look like. The desert winds that followed him became not cleansing, but corrosive, carrying sand that could strip paint from temple walls, flesh from bones, memory from minds. Even his temple at Ombos, where he had been worshipped as protector, began to feel different, darker, as if the god himself had become a different entity while keeping the same name. But Isis, sister wife to Osiris, mother of magic itself, would not let the story end with Set's victory. She gathered the pieces of Osiris that Set had scattered, all save one that had been swallowed by a fish in the Nile. She reconstituted her husband through magic that had never been performed before and would never be performed again, creating from death not life exactly, but something else, something that partook of both states while belonging fully to neither. Osiris became then the lord of the underworld, more powerful in death than he had ever been in life, ruling over the realm that all beings, mortal and divine, must eventually enter. And from this reconstituted god, Isis conceived Horus, the golden child, the avenger, the one who would reclaim the throne from Set. But this was not a simple story of good defeating evil, for Set had legitimate claim to rulership through might, through the ancient law that power belongs to those strong enough to take it and hold it. The conflict between Set and Horus would last for decades of divine time, centuries of mortal time, involving battles that reshaped the landscape of Egypt, that created the cataracts of the Nile, that established the boundaries between order and chaos, that would define Egyptian civilization for millennia. In their battles, both gods were permanently changed. Horus lost an eye, which became the symbol of divine kingship, of sacrifice for order, of the price of maintaining cosmic balance. Set lost. Well, what Set lost depends on which version of the story you follow. Some say he lost his testicles, his ability to create, to generate, to be anything other than destroyer. Others say he lost his shape, becoming permanently fluid, unable to maintain any form for long. A god of uncertainty in a pantheon that valued permanence above all things. The judgment, when it came, was not from a single source, but from the Ennead, the 9 great gods who maintained cosmic order. They deliberated for what would be years in human terms, weighing Set's crimes against his necessity, his evil against his essentiality. For even as they judged him, Apophis still threatened Ra's journey each night, and only Set had the ferocity to match the chaos serpents. To destroy Set entirely would be to leave existence vulnerable to an even greater chaos, an even more fundamental dissolution. Their solution was exile rather than execution, transformation rather than termination. Set would remain a god, but a diminished one, his power channeled, contained, directed solely toward the battle against Apophis. He would be forever the outsider, the one who protected the very order that rejected him, who served the very system that had cast him out. He became the god of necessary evil, acknowledged but not worshipped, essential but not loved, present but not welcomed. As we descend deeper into our nocturnal journey, passing through the 4th hour of divine catastrophe, the energy of our telling begins to slow, to deepen like a river approaching the sea, knowing that its individual identity must soon merge with something vast and undifferentiated. Here, in the realm between waking and sleeping, between consciousness and dream, we encounter perhaps the most famous fall of all, the one that has been painted on cathedral ceilings and whispered in confessionals, written in epic poems, and decoded in theological treatises. The fall of Lucifer, the light bringer, the morning star, the most beautiful of all created beings. To speak of Lucifer before his fall is to speak of beauty that preceded the concept of beauty, of light that existed before photons learned their dance, of music that played before sound waves understood how to propagate through space. He was, if the ancient texts are to be believed, the first thought of beauty that the divine mind conceived, the prototype of all aesthetic perfection that would follow, the template against which every subsequent creation would be measured and found, inevitably wanting. In the architecture of heaven, before architecture was a word, before heaven needed defining, Lucifer occupied a position that was neither highest nor lowest, but somehow most essential, like the keystone of an arch that bears no more weight than any other stone, yet without which the entire structure collapses. He was the translator of divine will into angelic action, the prism through which infinite light became the spectrum of creation, the voice that taught the cosmic chorus how to sing harmonies, that held galaxies in their gravitational embrace. Consider the mathematics of his beauty. Though mathematics insults it by trying to contain it in number. Every angle of his form was the perfect angle. Every curve the ideal curve. Every proportion the golden proportion that humans would later discover and think they had invented. When he moved through the heavenly spheres, and here we must use the word moved, while acknowledging its inadequacy. For angels do not move so much as redistribute their presence. When he moved, creation itself paid attention, oriented itself around him, like iron filings around a magnet, like planets around a sun, like thoughts around an idea too profound to fully think. His wings, and how can we describe wings that were not made of feathers, but of condensed possibility, of materialized potential, of light that had learned how to be solid without losing its essential lightness. His wings contained colors that humans have never seen, will never see, can never see, because their eyes were designed after Lucifer's fall, designed specifically to not perceive the kind of beauty that can drive one to either worship or madness, or perhaps both. Perhaps they are the same thing viewed from different angles. The other angels, those beings of terrifying beauty and purpose, looked upon Lucifer with something that was not quite worship, but was certainly more than admiration. They recognized in him what they themselves were, but perfected, completed, fully realized. Where they were words, he was poetry. Where they were notes, he was symphony. Where they were light, he was illumination, that quality that transforms mere visibility into understanding, mere seeing into comprehension. Yet, within this perfection, or perhaps because of it, stirred something that had no name because it had never existed before. Pride, we call it now, but that word is too small, too human, too contaminated by our own experiences of petty ego to properly convey what grew within Lucifer. It was more like the moment when a mirror becomes aware that it is reflecting, when it begins to prefer its own image to the thing it reflects, when it starts to believe that the light originates from itself rather than passing through it. The rebellion, when it came, was not a sudden eruption, but a slow crystallization, like water becoming ice, maintaining the same essential substance while changing into something that could no longer flow, could no longer adapt, could no longer receive. Lucifer began to question not the divine order, but his place within it, began to see hierarchy where before there had been harmony, began to perceive servitude where before there had been service freely given, joyfully rendered. Non serviam, I will not serve. 2 words, 3 syllables in the Latin that would not exist for eons after they were first spoken, that contained within them the birth of opposition, of alternative, of the very concept that there could be a way other than the way, a will other than the will, a light other than the light. In speaking these words, Lucifer created something that had never existed before, the possibility of no, in a reality that had only known yes, the possibility of discord in a cosmos that had only known harmony, the possibility of fall in a realm that had only known stability. The war in heaven, if war it can be called, when one side holds all power and the other holds only the power allowed to it, was less a battle than a revelation, less a conflict than a clarification. Michael, whose name means who is like God, stood against Lucifer, whose name means light bearer. And in their opposition was written the entire future history of choice, of consequence, of the terrible freedom that allows love to be meaningful. Because hatred is possible, that allows good to exist because evil is real, that allows rise because fall is always, always waiting. The combat between these 2 princes of heaven was not physical, for physicality had not yet condensed into its current limitations. It was a war of essences, of fundamental orientations toward existence, of the question of whether creation should flow downward from unity into multiplicity, or attempt to rise upward from multiplicity back into unity. Every blow exchanged between them created new concepts: justice, mercy, punishment, redemption, concepts that would later become the tools with which humans would try to understand their own moral existence. When Lucifer fell, he fell not through space, For space was still learning what it meant to have dimensions, but through states of being, through levels of reality, through gradients of existence that became less subtle, more material, more limited with each degree of descent. He fell for 9 days and 9 nights, though days and nights had not yet been separated, though 9 was not yet a number, but would become one specifically to measure this fall, to give quantity to what was essentially qualitative, to give duration to what was essentially eternal. With him fell a third of the heavenly host, though third implies a mathematical precision that didn't exist, implies that angels could be counted like coins, when they were more like thoughts, more like aspects of a single consciousness that had chosen to experience itself as multiple. These falling angels, following their prince into exile, transformed as they fell, their light condensing into darker substances, their songs becoming screams, their beauty inverting into something that was not ugliness exactly, but beauty turned inside out, beauty that hurt to perceive, beauty that destroyed rather than created. The impact of their landing created hell, though hell is not a place, but a state, not a location, but a condition, not somewhere you go, but something you become. It exists in the absence of divine presence, which is to say, it exists in the space that divine presence creates by defining itself, the shadow that light casts by being light, the cold that heat leaves behind by being heat. Hell is the no that yes requires to be meaningful, the resistance against which will must push to be will, the gravity that gives weight to grace. In hell, Lucifer became Satan, the adversary, though what he adverses is not God exactly, but the idea that there is only one way to be, one light to bear, one song to sing. He rules there still. If ruling means reigning over ruins, if power means having dominion over those who have lost everything, if kingdom means a realm defined entirely by what it is not, by what it lacks, by what it remembers but can never again attain. Yet, even in hell, even in his fallen state, something of the original light-bearer remains. Beauty corrupted is still beauty, just viewed through a lens that distorts, that darkens, that grieves. When Satan appears, for he does appear, walking to and fro upon the earth, seeking whom he may devour, he carries still that fundamental attractiveness, that gravitational pull that makes temptation tempting, that makes fall seem like flight, until the ground rises up to meet you. And now, as the hours of our journey passes through the membrane between story and dream, between narrative and hypnosis, we find ourselves in a realm where the texture of myth becomes tactile, where you can feel the roughness of the mountain stone against Prometheus's back. Taste the metallic tang of divine blood in the air. Hear the wing beats of an eagle that is more than eagle, that is consequence itself, given feathers and talons, and an appetite that renews itself with each dawn. Prometheus, whose name means forethought, who sees outcomes before they become outcomes, who knows endings before beginnings have properly begun, hangs suspended between earth and sky on Mount Caucasus. Though the mountain we speak of exists in no atlas, can be climbed by no mortal feet, rises through dimensions that cartography cannot map. His chains are forged from adamantine, a metal that exists only in the realm of divine punishment. A substance that grows stronger the more one struggles against it, that feeds on resistance, that transforms the prisoner's own strength into the mechanism of their imprisonment. To understand Prometheus's gift to humanity, we must understand what humanity was before the gift, what consciousness was like before it became conscious of itself, what thought was like before it could think about thinking. Picture, if you will, though picturing requires the very gift Prometheus gave, so we are caught in a paradox of imagination, imagining its own absence, picture beings that moved through the world like sophisticated automata, responding to stimuli without reflection, surviving without understanding, existing without truly being. They were beautiful in the way that animals are beautiful, perfect in their unconscious perfection, innocent in the way that only those who cannot conceive of guilt can be innocent. They lived, they died, they mated, they ate, they slept, but all without the spark that transforms mere biological function into experience, without the fire that burns inside the skull and allows the universe to observe itself through human eyes, to know itself through human minds, to question itself through human wonder. The fire Prometheus stole was not merely flame, though flame was its earthly manifestation, its material metaphor, its visible sign of an invisible grace. What he stole was divine consciousness itself, that quality that separates the aware from the unaware, the observer from the merely observed, the subject from the pure object. He took it from the forge of Hephaestus, or from the chariot of Helios, or from the hearth of Hestia, depending on which thread of story you follow through the labyrinth of myth. But the source matters less than the destination, less than the transformation it wrought. Concealed in a fennel stalk, that hollow reed that would forever after be associated with divine theft, with the transmission of forbidden knowledge, with the channel through which heaven's treasures flow illicitly to earth. Prometheus carried the fire down from Olympus. Each step of his descent was a choice, a decision to proceed with what he knew would bring him eternal suffering. For remember, he was forethought. He saw his own future stretched out before him like a map of agony, and still he walked, still he descended, still he delivered his gift. When humans received the fire, the change was not immediate but gradual, like dawn breaking, not all at once, but in stages of growing light. First came the ability to see in darkness, not just literally, but metaphorically, to perceive possibilities where before there had been only actualities. Then came the capacity to remember with purpose, to learn from experience rather than simply repeat it, to build upon the past rather than be condemned to relive it. Finally came the ultimate gift and curse, the knowledge of their own mortality, the awareness that they would die, which paradoxically made them truly alive. Zeus's rage, when he discovered the theft, was not the hot rage of impulse, but the cold rage of calculation, the fury of a king who sees not just present transgression but future consequence, who understands that Prometheus has not merely stolen fire, but has initiated a process that will eventually lead to the gods themselves being forgotten, replaced, reduced to stories told around the very fires that Prometheus provided. The punishment Zeus devised was therefore not just punishment, but poetry, not just consequence, but cosmic statement. The eagle that comes each day to devour Prometheus's liver is not a mere bird, but a fragment of Zeus himself, a piece of divine attention given form and appetite. It arrives with the dawn, its wings beating a rhythm that sounds like fate itself drumming against the boundaries of hope. Its talons, sharp enough to pierce divine flesh, grip the Titan's body with a familiarity born of repetition, of routine, of a relationship that has moved beyond torturer and victim into something more intimate, more terrible, more eternal. The liver, in ancient understanding, was the seat of emotion, of passion, of the very force that drove Prometheus to his act of theft. That it regenerates each night is not just biological impossibility, but mythological necessity. The punishment must fit not just the crime, but the criminal, must address not just what was done, but what continues to be done. For every time a human uses fire, discovers something new, pushes against the boundaries of their limitation, Prometheus's crime is committed anew, and so his punishment must be experienced anew. As the eagle feeds, and here we must slow our words to match the slow horror of the scene, as its beak tears through skin that has known this tearing thousands of times before, through muscle that has memorized every variation of this violation, into the organ that has died and been reborn more times. Then there are stars in the sky that Prometheus can see but never reach. As this happens, Prometheus remains conscious, remains aware, remains fundamentally unbroken, despite being literally broken open daily. His screams, if he still screams, and some say he has moved beyond screaming into a silence that is worse than any sound, echo across the valleys of the Caucasus, teaching the mountains themselves the vocabulary of suffering. Birds avoid the area, except for the eagle, of course. Plants grow differently here, twisted by proximity to divine agony, shaped by the constant presence of consequence made flesh. Even the wind changes direction rather than carry the scent of his pain to places where joy might still be possible. Yet, in his eyes, those eyes that have watched civilizations rise and fall, that have seen the fire he gave become cooking hearth and funeral pyre, forge and weapon, light and destruction. In those eyes burns still the same certainty that drove him to his theft. He regrets nothing, would change nothing, would steal the fire again and again and again, in every possible timeline, in every potential universe, because he knows something that Zeus either doesn't know or refuses to acknowledge. That consciousness, once given, cannot be taken back. That awareness, once awakened, cannot be put back to sleep. That the fire, once stolen, burns forever. The other titans, his brothers and sisters, imprisoned in Tartarus, or transformed into geographic features, or fade into obscurity, sometimes whisper his name in their various prisons, sometimes curse him for his stubborn pride, sometimes thank him for showing that even Zeus's power has limits, that even eternal punishment is still just punishment, that suffering for a cause transforms suffering into something else, something that might be called victory, if victory weren't too small a word for what Prometheus has achieved. Heracles will come, eventually, in the 13th generation of mortals, to break the chains and kill the eagle, though some say the eagle cannot truly die, only transform, only wait, only find new forms in which to enact the eternal drama of consequence. But Prometheus's freedom, when it comes, will be a strange freedom. For how can one who has been defined by bondage for millennia suddenly exist without chains? How can one whose identity has become inseparable from suffering suddenly cease to suffer? Perhaps this is Zeus's true punishment, that even freedom becomes a kind of prison when you've been captive long enough. The fire burns on in human hearts and human hearts, in every question asked and every boundary pushed, in every act of creation and every moment of defiance. Children learn to speak, and in speaking carry Prometheus's gift. Scientists split atoms, and in splitting echo his theft. Artists create beauty from nothing, and in creating continue his crime. Every human who has ever lived, lives now, or will live, carries within them the stolen fire, making them all accomplices to Prometheus's transgression, all beneficiaries of his suffering, all participants in the eternal drama of consciousness wrestling with its own existence. In the depths of the 6th hour, when sleep has become so deep that even dreams dream, when consciousness has dissolved into something more fundamental than thought, we descend into the primordial waters, where Tiamat dwells, or dwelt, or continues to dwell in the dismembered eternity of gods who exist before existence, after existence, outside the very concept of existing. Here, in the saltwater chaos that preceded freshwater order, in the feminine abyss that gave birth to the masculine structures that would eventually destroy her, we find the oldest story of divine downfall. The first fall, the prototype of every cosmic catastrophe that would follow. Tiamat is not was, for the primordial cannot properly be said to have existed in past tense when past itself is one of her children. One of the concepts that emerged from her union with Apsu, the freshwater deep, the masculine principle that was not her opposite, but her complement, not her enemy, but her lover, not her destroyer, but the father of her destroyers. Together, they were the original duality that was actually unity. The first two that were actually one, the separation that existed only to make union possible. In their mingling, and here language fails us completely, for how can we describe the intercourse of principles, the lovemaking of fundamental forces, the reproduction of entities that exist before biology, before chemistry, before physics itself has crystallized into laws. In their mingling, the younger gods were born. Not born as humans are born, through pain and blood, and the ripping of flesh, but born as thoughts are born, as possibilities suddenly become actual, as potential collapses into specific form. These younger gods were noisy. This is what the stories tell us. Though noise meant something different in the time before sound waves, before air to carry them, before ears to hear them, their noise was the noise of differentiation, of things becoming separate, of unity fracturing into multiplicity. They played, and their play created time. They fought, and their fighting created space. They loved, and their love created the possibility of things that were neither Tiamat nor Apsu, but something new, something other, something that the primordial parents had not anticipated when they began their eternal dance. Apsu grew weary of the noise, though weariness in a god who predates exhaustion is not what we would recognize as tiredness. He wanted to destroy the younger gods, to return to the silence that was not absence of sound, but presence of undifferentiated potential. He consulted with Mummu, his vizier, though what counsel means when all parties exist within each other. When advisor and advised are aspects of the same cosmic principle, we cannot truly comprehend. But Ea, clever Ea, god of wisdom that had learned to be cunning, overheard or intuited, or simply knew, as gods know things, about Apsu's plan, and Ea killed Apsu, though killing here means something more like transformation, more like crystallization, more like taking that which was fluid and making it fixed. Apsu became the fresh waters of the earth, the rivers and lakes and springs that would nurture civilization. His death becoming the foundation upon which life would build itself. Tiamat's grief at Apsu's death was not the grief of a widow, though she was that, but the grief of existence, discovering that it could cease to exist, that immortality could know mortality, that the eternal could end. Her grief was creative, generative, productive of monsters that had never been imagined because imagination itself was still learning what it meant to imagine. She gave birth to the 11, though 11 is just a number we use to contain the uncontainable, to quantify the unquantifiable, to give structure to chaos itself. These 11 were not creatures as we understand creatures, with bodies and minds and purposes, but were more like principles of destruction given form, like nightmares that had learned to be real, like the fears of gods themselves made manifest. The viper, whose venom could dissolve the bonds between atoms, though atoms hadn't been invented yet. The dragon, whose breath could unmake the laws that governed reality, though those laws were still being written. The Sphinx, whose riddles could cause gods to forget their own names, their own natures, their own reasons for existing. Among them moved Kingu, whom Tiamat took as her new consort, giving him the tablets of destiny, though destiny itself was still fluid, still negotiable, still more suggestion than decree. With Kingu at her side and her 11 monsters surrounding her, Tiamat prepared for war against the younger gods who had killed her beloved, who had disturbed her peace, who had taken the gift of existence she had given them and used it to destroy the giver. The younger gods trembled, and their trembling created earthquakes in lands that didn't yet exist, storms in skies that hadn't yet separated from seas, fear in hearts that hadn't yet learned to beat. They turned to Marduk, youngest of them all, containing within himself all their powers combined. Though combination implies they were ever truly separate, which they were not, are not, can never be. Marduk's price for fighting Tiamat was sovereignty over all gods, dominion over all creation, the right to speak and have reality conform to his words. The older gods agreed, not because they wanted to, but because want itself was being redefined by necessity, by the first crisis, by the original moment when existence had to choose between chaos and order, between the mother and the children, between the primordial unity and the differentiated multiplicity. The battle between Marduk and Tiamat was not a battle as humans understand battle, with strategy and tactics, advance and retreat, victory and defeat. It was more like a fundamental disagreement about the nature of nature, a cosmic argument about whether existence should be one thing or many things, whether chaos should contain order or order should contain chaos, whether the mother has the right to unmake what she has made. Marduk came with the four winds, though wind is too small a word for the forces he commanded. The wind from the future that carries prophecy, the wind from the past that carries memory, the wind from above that carries authority, the wind from below that carries revolution. He came with weapons forged from concepts that Tiamat had never conceived. The net that could catch chaos itself, the bow that could shoot arrows of causality, the mace that could crush not bodies but possibilities. When they met, creation itself held its breath, though breath hadn't been invented yet, though holding was still learning what it meant to grip, though creation was exactly what hung in the balance. Tiamat opened her mouth to devour Marduk, to return him to the undifferentiated chaos from which he had emerged, to unmake him as thoroughly as Ea had unmade Apsu. But Marduk sent the winds into her mouth, inflating her like a balloon, though balloons wouldn't exist for millennia, like a bubble, though bubbles were still just potential, like a universe expanding from a single point, which is exactly what was happening. With Tiamat distended, unable to close her mouth, unable to swallow, unable to return Marduk to the primordial unity, he shot an arrow down her throat, through her heart, if heart she had, through her essence, if essence is the right word for what animated her. The arrow split her in two, though two is too simple for the division that occurred. She split into up and down, in and out, before and after, here and there, self and other. Every duality that would ever exist emerging from this fundamental splitting. From her upper half, Marduk made the sky, the dome that would separate the waters above from the waters below. Though separation is an illusion, though the waters remember their unity, though every raindrop is Tiamat trying to reconstitute herself. From her lower half, he made the earth solid and stable, though solidity is temporary, though stability is an agreed-upon lie, though every earthquake is Tiamat turning in her sleep. From her eyes flowed the Tigris and Euphrates, the rivers that would nurture civilization, though civilization is just another word for the process of forgetting that we are all made from the body of chaos. From her blood, mixed with earth, came humans. Though the mixture was imperfect, though the proportions were slightly wrong, though every human carries within them the confusion of being simultaneously order and chaos, earth and divinity, mortal and eternal, as it was in the beginning, before beginning had learned to begin, before the first moment had discovered how to become the second moment, there was Uranus, the sky itself made conscious, the dome of heaven given will, the vast expanse that exists between earth and nothing personified into something that could love, could hate, could desire, could fear. His body was the sky, not metaphorically, but literally. Every star a paw in his infinite skin, every cloud a thought passing through his atmospheric mind, every wind a breath from lungs that encompassed all breathable space. His union with Gaia, the earth, was not a marriage as we understand marriage, but a constant state of being, a perpetual pressing down of sky upon earth that was simultaneously embrace and imprisonment, love and suffocation, creation and prevention of creation. For Gaia was pregnant, perpetually pregnant, with children that could not be born because there was no space between earth and sky for them to emerge into. No gap between mother and father for offspring to exist as separate beings. Within Gaia's womb, if womb is the right word for the creative center of a being who is herself, the creative center of everything, grew the Titans, the Cyclopes, the Hecatoncheires, beings of such power and strangeness that even their parents feared what they might become if allowed to fully manifest. The Titans were time and memory, justice and natural law, the sun and the moon, the rivers and the seas, all contained within Gaia, pressing against her boundaries, seeking release into existence. The Cyclopes were something else. Craftsmen of impossibility, makers of things that should not be able to exist, thunderbolts that could kill immortals, helmets that granted invisibility not just to body, but to divine essence itself, tridents that could shake the foundations of reality. They had single eyes, not because they lacked vision, but because they saw too deeply, too truly, perceiving the singular truth behind every apparent duality. The Hecatoncheires were stranger still, each with 50 heads and 100 hands. Though these numbers are just attempts to describe something that exists outside of quantity, something so multiple it becomes singular again, so complex it achieves a terrible simplicity. They were violence before violence had learned restraint, strength before strength had learned gentleness, power before power had learned to be anything other than absolute. Uranus, feeling or knowing or simply being aware in the way that sky is aware of everything that happens beneath it, that these children would challenge his supremacy, would change the perfect, unchanging union of sky and earth, pressed down harder, refusing to allow them to be born, condemning them to eternal gestation, eternal potential without actualization, eternal becoming without ever quite being. Gaia's pain was not the pain of a woman in labor, though it included that, but the pain of creativity denied, of potential suppressed, of futures that cannot become present. Every earthquake was a contraction that could not complete itself. Every volcano was a child trying to be born through whatever opening it could create. Every mountain was Gaia's body distorting itself around the life it contained, but could not release. In her desperation, Gaia created the sickle, though creation is too gentle a word for what she did. She condensed her pain into metal, her rage into edge, her determination into a tool that could cut through the very fabric of primordial union. The sickle was made from adamantine, the same substance that would later bind Prometheus, as if the universe has only one material suitable for the most fundamental violations, the most necessary crimes, the most transformative violence. She called to her children, still trapped within her, speaking to them through the medium of their shared flesh, through vibrations in the earth that was simultaneously her body and their prison. Most of them recoiled from what she asked, for even unborn, even unrealized, they understood that to castrate the sky was to fundamentally alter the nature of existence itself, to introduce into the cosmos a wound that would never heal, a separation that could never be truly bridged. But Kronos, youngest and cleverest, or perhaps oldest and most patient, depending on how you count time before time was countable, agreed. He took the sickle, though taking implies he had hands, which he didn't yet, not fully. Not until the moment of taking created the possibility of having hands to take with. He waited, though waiting implies time, which didn't properly exist until Kronos created it through his waiting, until the moment when Uranus would descend upon Gaia in what had become their nightly ritual of union and suppression. When Uranus came down, as he always came down, as he had been coming down since the separation of sky and earth had created the possibility of reunion, Kronos struck. The sickle moved through space that wasn't quite space, through flesh that was more than flesh, through the connection between sky and earth that was both physical and metaphysical, both real and symbolic, both necessary and suddenly, violently severed. The scream that Uranus released was not sound, but the birth of sound, not noise, but the creation of the possibility of noise. It taught the universe what pain meant. what violation felt like, what it was to lose something that had been so fundamentally part of oneself, that its absence created not just loss, but redefinition. The sky recoiled upward, separating from Earth not gradually but instantly, creating for the first time the space between, the realm where things could exist that were neither earth nor sky, but something else, something new, something unprecedented. The blood that fell from Uranus's wound was not blood as we understand it, but ichor, the golden fluid that runs through divine veins, each drop containing within it the power to create, to transform, to generate new forms of existence. Where it fell upon the earth, upon Gaia, who received it with a mixture of triumph and horror, it gave birth to the Erinyes, the Furies, vengeance personified, justice without mercy, consequence without forgiveness. They emerged fully formed, ancient at the moment of their birth, carrying within them the memory of the first crime, the original sin, the necessary evil that made all subsequent good and evil possible. Also from this blood came the giants, beings of such size and power that they would later challenge the Olympian gods themselves, as if Uranus's severed divinity sought to reconstitute itself in new forms, to reclaim through violence what had been lost through violence. And the Meliae, the ash tree nymphs, from whose wood would come the spears that humans would use to wage war, as if the violence of this first overthrow needed to propagate itself through all subsequent history, through every conflict that would ever arise between parent and child, between old and new, between what is and what could be, the genitals themselves, cast into the sea by Kronos with a gesture that was both contemptuous and fearful, did not sink, but floated, carried by currents that had just learned what it meant to carry, surrounded by foam that was white like bone, like milk, like the possibility of new beginning. From this foam arose Aphrodite, beauty born from violence, love born from severance, desire born from the destruction of the original union. She emerged fully grown, fully beautiful, fully dangerous, carrying within her the power to unite what had been separated, but also to separate what had been united. The eternal tension between connection and isolation that would define all love thereafter. Uranus, castrated, separated, fundamentally diminished, retreated to the highest reaches of the sky, so far that he became less personality than principle, less God than concept. The dome that exists but no longer presses. The father who exists but no longer fathers. His curse upon Kronos, spoken with what remained of his divine authority, was that Kronos too would be overthrown by his children, that the pattern of succession through violence would continue, that the wound inflicted upon the cosmos would never heal, but would instead replicate itself through every generation of power. The Titans, finally born, emerging into the space that their brothers' violence had created, looked upon what Kronos had done with a mixture of gratitude and fear. They were free, but freedom had come at a price that made them wonder if imprisonment might not have been preferable. They could exist as separate beings, but separation meant also the possibility of conflict, of betrayal, of the very overthrow that had made their existence possible. Kronos took his father's throne, if throne is the right word for the position of supreme authority over a cosmos still learning what authority meant. He married Rhea, his sister, maintaining the tradition of divine incest that keeps power within the family, even as it generates the tensions that will eventually destroy that family. Under his rule, time began to flow in the way we understand it, sequentially, causally, irreversibly. The Golden Age began, that period of perfection that was perfect only because it contained within it the seeds of its own destruction. As it was in the beginning, so it would be in the end, though end is too final a word for the cycle that Uranus's overthrow initiated. Every son would fear his father. Every father would fear his son. Every generation would overthrow the previous generation, not because they wanted to, but because the pattern had been cut into the fabric of existence itself by that first adamantine sickle, that first necessary crime, that first moment when the child realized that to fully exist, the parent must be diminished. The sky still bears the scar of that primordial castration, visible sometimes in the way clouds tear apart to reveal the void behind them, in the way the sunset bleeds across the horizon, in the way the night sky seems not solid, but wounded, perforated by stars that are perhaps not lights, but holes through which the original chaos still watches, still remembers, still grieves for the unity that was lost when Kronos raised his sickle and brought it down, severing forever the possibility of unchanging perfection. And now, as sleep has become so deep that even the concept of depth has dissolved, as consciousness has spread so thin that it exists everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, we begin the great weaving, the drawing together of threads that seemed separate but were always part of the same tapestry. The recognition that these 7 falls are not 7 stories, but 7 verses of the same eternal song of power and loss, of reaching and falling, of the inevitability that what rises must descend, what rules must be overthrown, what exists must eventually exist differently. Return with me now to Kronos, no longer the revolutionary who freed his siblings, but the tyrant who swallowed his children, bound forever in Tartarus, that realm below reality, where defeated titans contemplate their defeats, where time itself is imprisoned by the very beings time gave birth to. In his chains, which are not so different from the chains that bind Loki, that bind Prometheus, he experiences every moment of his existence simultaneously. The triumph of overthrowing Uranus, the fear of being overthrown himself, the swallowing of his children, the vomiting of them forth, the brief glory of rule, the eternal consequence of having ruled. He is the god of time, experiencing all time at once. The ultimate prison for one who once controlled sequence, who once could make moments move according to his will. Consider how his story reflects in Loki's binding, how both are not merely punished, but transformed into warnings, into examples, into the universe teaching itself what happens when the fundamental order is challenged. Loki, who like Kronos could not accept his place in the hierarchy, who like Kronos destroyed something beautiful and irreplaceable, who like Kronos is bound not just by chains, but by the consequences of his own nature. The serpent that drips venom on Loki's face is not so different from the knowledge that drips constantly into Kronos' consciousness, that his father's curse was true, that patterns once established cannot be broken, that every revolution contains within it the seeds of its own eventual revolution. And here, Set enters the weaving. He who like Kronos killed his brother, who like Loki could not bear to see another loved more than himself, who transformed from protector to destroyer. Because the line between those two roles is thinner than the edge of the blade that separated Uranus from his power. Set wanders now in the desert places, in the red lands beyond the black soil of the Nile, forever the outsider, forever the necessary evil that protects the very order that has rejected him. His story is their story, is our story. The tale of those who serve essential functions but are never loved for their service, who are needed but not wanted, who exist in the margins that define the center. See how Lucifer's fall mirrors and magnifies all of these others. How his non serviam echoes Kronos' raising of the sickle, Loki's refusal to weep for Balder, Set's murder of Osiris. But Lucifer's fall is also unique, for he fell not from power seized, but from power granted, not from revolution, but from the refusal to accept revolution's opposite, which is submission. He fell through dimensions that the others never knew existed, from heights they never achieved, into depths they cannot fathom. Yet, in his fall is the template for all falls, the original sin that makes all other sins possible, the first no that created the space for every subsequent negation. Prometheus hangs still on his mountain, experiencing a punishment that is cousin to all these others, yet fundamentally different. For his crime was not against the gods, but for humanity, not taking power for himself, but giving it to others. His binding is teaching, his suffering is gift. His eternal regeneration and consumption is the daily renewal of human consciousness, the price paid continuously for the fire that allows humans to see in the darkness, to think about thinking, to become something more than they were meant to be. Every dawn that brings the eagle brings also the sun that Prometheus made visible to human eyes. Every moment of agony is simultaneously a moment of triumph, for the gift once given cannot be taken back. And beneath all of these, before all of these, forming the foundation upon which all these stories rest, lies Tiamat, divided into sky and earth, murdered and transformed into the very stage upon which these dramas play out. Her body is the cosmic substance from which all else is made. Her blood, the rivers that flow through every mythology. Her eyes, the lights that illuminate every pantheon. She is the primordial fall that makes all other falls possible. The first division that creates the space for all subsequent conflicts. The mother whose death gives birth to the possibility of all these fathers and sons destroying each other in endless succession. Finally, Uranus, the sky father whose castration started the pattern, who exists now, not as personality, but as principle, as the dome above that no longer touches the earth below, as the separation that makes all other separations possible. His overthrow by Kronos, who was overthrown by Zeus, who will perhaps be overthrown in turn, though that story has not yet been told, perhaps can never be told. For to tell it would be to end the cycle that keeps existence existing, that keeps the cosmos from collapsing back into the primordial unity that Tiamat represented before Marduk split her, before division became the fundamental characteristic of reality. These seven are not separate beings, but aspects of the same cosmic principle. The principle that power corrupts, not because power is evil, but because power is incomplete. Because to have power over others is to lack power over oneself. Because to rule is to invite revolution. Because to rise is to create the possibility of fall. They are the seven notes in the eternal song of consequence, the seven colors in the spectrum of divine catastrophe, the 7 days in the week of cosmic judgment. Though 7 is just a number we use to contain the infinite variations on this single theme. In Kronos, we see the revolutionary who becomes the tyrant. In Loki, the outsider who cannot bear his exclusion. In Set, the necessary evil that resents its necessity. In Lucifer, the perfect being who cannot accept imperfection in his position. In Prometheus, the foreseer who chooses suffering over ignorance. In Tiamat, the mother who must die for children to live. In Uranus, the father who must be overthrown for time to begin. Each contains all the others. Each story is all stories. Each fall is the same fall experienced from different angles, in different lights, with different consequences, that are all the same consequence. That power separated from wisdom, strength separated from compassion, authority separated from service, becomes its own undoing. And now, as our long night's journey approaches its end, though endings are always beginnings, seen from another perspective, though the circle we have traced has no true termination point, we find ourselves in that liminal space where sleep prepares to release its hold, where dreams begin to dissolve back into the unconscious ocean from which they emerged, where the stories we have followed through divine catastrophe and cosmic consequence begin to fade like stars before the approaching dawn. The gods we have walked with tonight, Kronos in his eternal chains, Loki beneath his dripping serpent, Set in his desert exile, Lucifer in his beautiful damnation, Prometheus on his mountain of regenerating agony, Tiamat in her dismembered omnipresence, Uranus in his severed transcendence. They do not end when our story ends, do not cease when our consciousness of them ceases, do not sleep when we wake or wake when we sleep. They exist in that eternal present tense that mythology inhabits, always falling, always fallen, always about to fall. Their stories not historical events, but ongoing processes, patterns that repeat themselves in every moment of existence, in every choice between order and chaos, submission and rebellion, acceptance and defiance. What we have learned in these slow hours, if learning is possible in the state between waking and sleeping, if knowledge can be transmitted through rhythm and repetition, rather than logic and argument, is that divine downfall is not aberration, but necessity, not exception, but rule, not punishment, but the price of existence itself. To be is to change. To change is to fall from what one was. To fall is to create the space for others to rise. To rise is to begin the process again. Eternal, inescapable, beautiful in its terrible consistency. The fire that Prometheus stole burns now in your consciousness as you lie between sleeping and waking. The same fire that lights the stars, that powers the sun, that allows thought to observe itself thinking. You carry within you the gifts of all these fallen gods. Kronos' awareness of time, Loki's ability to transform, Set's knowledge of necessary evil, Lucifer's understanding of beauty and rebellion. Prometheus's capacity for sacrifice, Tiamat's creative chaos, Uranus's sky-reaching aspiration. You are the inheritor of their falls, the beneficiary of their punishments, the living proof that their sufferings were not in vain. As the dawn approaches, though dawn is always approaching somewhere, as the night releases its hold, though night is always falling elsewhere, as sleep prepares to transform into waking, though someone somewhere is always making the opposite transition. Remember that you have been traveling not through stories, but through patterns, not through myths, but through the deep structures that myths attempt to describe. The fundamental processes that govern not just gods but galaxies, not just divine drama, but quantum mechanics, not just ancient tales, but the everyday experience of power gained and lost, of rules established and broken, of the eternal dance between what is and what could be. The mountains where Prometheus hangs exist in every landscape where suffering serves a purpose greater than itself. The cave where Loki rides exists beneath every surface where consequences wait to emerge. The desert where Set wanders exists at the edge of every civilization, defining it by opposition. The depth to which Lucifer fell exists in every height from which pride can tumble. The chains that bind Kronos exist in every moment that cannot escape its own nature. The pieces of Tiamat exist in every fragment of reality that remembers wholeness. The wound of Uranus exists in every separation that makes existence possible. You have been listening to these stories, but more than listening, you have been participating in them. For every human life recapitulates these divine catastrophes on a smaller scale. Every child overthrows every parent simply by growing into their own authority. Every creative act destroys the chaos from which it emerges. Every choice to help others brings suffering to the chooser. Every refusal to serve creates a fall from grace. Every use of power contains the seeds of that power's eventual loss. Every rise predicts its own fall. Every fall enables its own rise. In cycles that spiral through dimensions we can sense but not see, can feel but not fully understand. The voices of these fallen gods whisper now at the edge of your awareness, not in words, but in the rustle of sheets, in the rhythm of your breathing, in the pulse of blood through veins that remember when they were rivers in Tiamat's body, when they were ichor in Uranus's wound, when they were the chains made from Narfi's entrails, when they were the eagle returning each dawn to Prometheus's liver. Their whispers say nothing and everything, communicate absence and presence, speak the unspeakable truth that power and loss, rise and fall, creation and destruction are not opposites, but partners in the dance that keeps existence existing. As consciousness begins to reassert itself, as the familiar world begins to reform around you, as the extraordinary gradually becomes ordinary again, carry with you the knowledge that you have touched, however briefly, the eternal patterns that underlie all temporary forms. You have walked with gods in their moments of greatest triumph and deepest defeat, have witnessed the cosmic crimes that make mortal virtue possible, have seen how every ending is a transformation, every punishment a teaching, every fall a gift to those who come after. The mythological realm withdraws now, not departing, but simply becoming invisible again, hidden beneath the surface of everyday experience like veins beneath skin, like bones beneath flesh, like the divine skeleton that holds up the mundane world. But you know now, in that deep knowing that exists below thought, that the gods are always falling, always fallen, always about to fall. Their eternal catastrophe, the engine that drives time forward, that prevents existence from crystallizing into fatal perfection, that ensures there will always be another story, another cycle, another chance for rise after fall, for creation after destruction, for dawn after the longest night. Sleep releases you now, if it hasn't already, back into a world where time moves in only one direction, where forms remain relatively stable, where gods seem like distant myths rather than present realities. But you carry their fire within you, the stolen flame that makes you human, that makes you conscious, that makes you capable of your own small rebellions, your own necessary failures, your own divine downfalls, that are also always, simultaneously, resurrections. The circle closes where it began, with you, listening in the darkness, surrounded by the invisible presence of fallen divinity, carrying within yourself all the potential for rise and fall that has ever existed, will ever exist, exists eternally in the present moment. That is all moments. The space that is all spaces, the story that is all stories. You are the inheritor of divine catastrophe, the child of cosmic consequence, the living proof that falling is not failure but transformation, not ending but beginning, not defeat but the strange, terrible, beautiful victory of existence itself, continuing despite everything, continuing because of everything continuing. And so our 3-hour journey through divine downfall comes not to conclusion, but to suspension, like a note held at the edge of hearing, like a breath taken but not yet released, like sleep that hovers at the boundary of waking. The gods we have followed continue their eternal sufferings and triumphs. Kronos remains in Tartarus, experiencing all time simultaneously. Loki writhes beneath his serpent, causing earthquakes with his agony. Set wanders the red desert, protecting the order that rejects him. Lucifer rules in hell, beautiful still in his corruption. Prometheus regenerates nightly for the eagle's return. Tiamat exists dismembered as the very cosmos itself. Uranus retreats ever higher into abstract principle. Their stories continue, will always continue, must continue, for they are not stories but the patterns that make stories possible, not myths, but the structures that myths attempt to describe, not the past, but the eternal present in which all divine dramas simultaneously unfold. You have been their witness, their companion, their fellow traveler through the landscapes of consequence. You have seen how gods fall, how power fails, how pride precedes destruction, how every throne is also a prison, how every crown is also a chain. Rest now, whether in sleep or waking, carrying within you the gentle weight of these ancient tales, these eternal patterns, these divine disasters that are also divine gifts. Let the last echoes of their voices fade into the ambient sounds of your world returning. The distant traffic that is also the rumble of titan chains, the wind that is also the breath of dismembered Tiamat, the settling of your dwelling that is also Loki's writhing, the approaching dawn that is also the eagle returning to Prometheus. You have traveled far tonight without moving, have witnessed eons without aging, have absorbed the deepest teachings through the simple act of listening in the darkness. The gods thank you for your attention, for your witness, for your participation in the eternal retelling that keeps their stories alive, that prevents their falls from being mere endings, that transforms their catastrophes into teachings, their punishments into gifts, their eternal sufferings into the strange beauty that makes existence more than mere being, that makes consciousness more than mere awareness, that makes human life a participation in divine drama, small but essential, temporary but eternal, falling and rising with each breath, each heartbeat, each moment of consciousness observing itself, knowing itself, continuing despite and because of everything. The silence that follows is not empty but full, pregnant with all the stories we have told and all the stories yet to be told, all the falls that have happened and all the falls yet to come, all the gods that have been overthrown and all the gods waiting to be born from the overthrow. In this silence, everything ends and everything begins. Everything sleeps and everything wakes. Everything falls and everything rises, eternal, cyclical, beautiful, terrible, necessary, forever and always, world without end, fall without flaw, story without conclusion. Rest now, dream now, wake now, continue now. The gods are with you, in you are you. In every moment of power and weakness, every experience of rise and fall, every divine catastrophe that is also human comedy, every human tragedy that is also divine necessity. You are the stage upon which these eternal dramas play out, the consciousness through which these patterns recognize themselves, the temporary form through which the eternal expresses itself, falling and rising, rising and falling, forever and always, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be. World without end, in the name of all that falls, all that rises, all that continues. Sweet dreams, dear listener, or gentle waking, whichever finds you at the end of our journey that is no end, our conclusion that is continuation, our final words that echo into infinite silence, infinite possibility, infinite return.